Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Northwest TTC webinar. My name is Beatrice Carlini, and I wear several hats here in Northwest TTC. One of them is to organize the webinar. So very good to see you all here. We are going to wait like literally 1 minute more to let people join in, and then we get started. We already have a good crowd. Okay, we are going to get started then with our August webinar. Our theme today is addressing youth substance abuse in the juvenile justice system. Just notice that the presentation will be recorded and is going to be made available on our website. And also that you can make questions, but they are only going to be answered in the end, but you can type it at any time. Okay, so let's first introduce our presenters for today. We have a great lineup. So we are going to start with Dr. Van Warmer. She is a professor, assistant professor at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington, and is also the co-director of the Center for the Justice, for the Study of Advancement of Justice Effectiveness, SAGE. I'm having a hard time pronouncing things today, so bear with me. After her presentation, we are going to be followed by Mr. Leblang. He is a faculty here at University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and come to us with more than 24 years of experience on training and consultation on intervention models for youth with substance abuse and behavioral health needs. So without further ado, we are gonna now, we are doing a three-way webinar. People are all remote. So we are gonna pass to Dr. Van Warmer, and it may take a little second for things to work. Welcome, Dr. Van Warmer.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone who's been able to join in on the webinar. It's great that you are able to spend the next hour with us, and I appreciate your dedication to this topic and to your willingness to continue to learn more about best practices in the field of adolescent substance abuse for those that are juvenile justice involved. I'm going to attempt to advance the slides here. And of course, I believe I'm technology savvy until it comes to something like this. So there we go. We have a two-part presentation today, and my colleague Josh really does have some fantastic information to share with you today regarding direct practice. I wanted to talk at a bit of a different angle regarding treating adolescents with substance abuse issues within the juvenile justice system. We know, of course, that there's many different manners and mechanisms in which to do that, but one of the more common modalities, or a more popular, one of the popular modalities has been juvenile drug treatment courts. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time this afternoon, just about 15 minutes, explaining some new advancements in the field. And while I recognize that not all courts, juvenile court systems, or treatment systems have access to or utilize drug treatment courts, there is a new set of guidelines that are available that are really quite applicable to both existing juvenile drug treatment court programs, but also just the general juvenile justice system. So we'll go ahead, and I wanted to share with you that the materials that I'm going to present were funded through a grant by OJJDP. And of course, this is the classic disclaimer that we have to give before any presentation, which is that the U.S. Department of Justice nor OJJDP are necessarily responsible for or endorse the views, opinions, or contents expressed in these documents. Although I will say they've been approved by OJJDP. Let me just talk very quickly about the history of the juvenile drug court movement. As most of you are fully aware, juvenile drug treatment courts were modeled off of the successful adult drug court model. They developed in the early 1990s, really before we had any research or science behind the effectiveness of the whole notion of a problem-solving court model. But the juvenile courts started to adopt this model, which for those of you that operate juvenile drug treatment courts, you know is more of an intensive intervention for youth, usually requires weekly court sessions and requires involvement with a team, with a judge and a prosecutor, a public defender, the treatment provider. Treatment's a very central component to the effectiveness of this process, case management, probation, and coordinators in schools. And there's weekly appearances, lots of therapies, works that happen in between those court sessions as well. The courts, when they first started, there was no really guiding document for juvenile drug treatment courts to follow, so they began by following what we call the 10 key components for drug courts. And those were created in 1997 for adult drug courts. And so there was a recognition that those were really not necessarily applicable standards or recommendations for juvenile drug courts, that we really needed to go a bit further in providing some strategies and an overview document for juvenile drug treatment courts to use. And that's when the Juvenile Drug Court's 16 Strategies in Practice was created in 2003. Now, at that time, like I just mentioned a few minutes ago, the field was still emerging, and so were the studies about the effectiveness of these models. And so when those were created, it was really just a consensus document that provided a framework for planning and implementing and operating a juvenile drug treatment court. But we really didn't know whether or not those strategies, any of those 16 strategies, were correlated with reductions in recidivism or increases in treatment completion rates for adolescents that go through the programs. And so I tend to seem to be jumping slides here a little bit, but I'm not sure what's happening here. Okay, we'll stop right here, hopefully. The initiative to develop these new juvenile drug treatment court guidelines came from the prior administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, pulling together a group of researchers, and I had the opportunity to participate in the task force back in 2012, 2013, with this question of, do these programs work to reduce recidivism and provide effective treatment? And if not, should we continue to support and move forward the juvenile drug court movement? And it was decided at the time that yes, the research, although inconclusive about the effectiveness of these models, the juvenile drug treatment court model, it was still really important to provide further documentation, further guidelines for juvenile courts to be able to follow, so that they could be aligned with greater best practices and evidence-based practices, because the field, of course, had been advancing. The general juvenile justice literature had been advancing, as had the treatment literature had been advancing as well. So what OJJDP did was it was a $6 million investment in not only creating new guidelines for juvenile drug treatment courts to follow, but also now we have close to a dozen sites across the country that are now testing these guidelines. They're part of an extensive research project, and we'll be then evaluating. There's numerous groups that are evaluating now the effectiveness of these guidelines, and it basically measuring if these juvenile drug treatment courts follow the guidelines, do these juveniles in these programs have better treatment outcomes? So, of course, the guidelines are built heavily off of the research on adolescent substance use and treatment, and somewhat on the research for juvenile drug treatment courts. But as I mentioned, the juvenile drug treatment court literature really tells us that the evaluations show that the effectiveness of juvenile drug courts, it's really been inconclusive. However, there is a very large body of literature around effectiveness programming in the general juvenile justice field, as well as the juvenile treatment field. And so the guidelines were built primarily or heavily from a wide range of juvenile justice interventions, not just juvenile drug treatment courts. Now, I don't want to frighten anybody, but this is, if you were to Google juvenile drug treatment court guidelines, it would take you to this webpage on OJJDP, on the OJJDP website. And the great thing about this is the guidelines that have been developed, it was again, research informed, lots of different entities, individuals, researchers, academics, practitioners, judges worked on the creation of these guidelines. But essentially what there's 7 major guidelines that you can see here, which are the bars. And then these round buttons on the website, you can actually hover over these round circles, because those are each of the guidelines. So there's 7 major objectives and then 31 guidelines that follow. And the wonderful thing about this visual, and again, on the website, when you hover over these radial dots, it pops open all sorts of information. It tells you what is the research base behind it, because if there was no research base, it wasn't going to be included in the guidelines. It gives you practice and implementation tips, and it gives you just, it's a great section to really kind of dig deep to think about, okay, here's the research and here's how we put that into practice. So, as I just mentioned, there's these 7 main objectives. The one thing I do want to say about the juvenile drug treatment court guidelines is that, again, they can be applied in the general juvenile justice system. You don't have to be operating one of these programs. But foundational to the guidelines is several frameworks that kind of blend throughout all of the guidelines. And that, of course, is regarding effective treatment for adolescents and families. There's a real renewed and heavy emphasis on family engagement. There is some research actually from the juvenile drug court model that tells us when families are engaged and participating in their own services or in joint services with their youth, those children have better outcomes. And it also provides a new framework regarding adolescent development and really utilizing the developmental perspective and considering trauma as well, and adverse childhood experiences and how to work with that. So I just want to talk very briefly about each of these objectives, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and co-presenter, and he'll kind of give you some examples of effective treatment strategies and take it a little bit deeper for you. But again, like I said, all of these objectives and these guidelines applicable to both an operating court and then a drug court, and then also just for the general juvenile justice system. But this first objective is really about the philosophy and the practice of addressing substance use and criminogenic needs. So it focuses in on the team and the team philosophy and practice, and how the roles for each team member needs to be clearly articulated. It places a heavy emphasis on the engagement of participants from school systems in order to overcome educational barriers that youth with substance use disorders face. And it focuses as well on engagement of family, being juvenile courts and drug courts being very deliberate about engaging parents or guardians throughout the court process. And working to address barriers to their full engagement. And again, there's great examples and ideas on the website for that. And if you have any questions, of course, we can tackle that at the end, because I know that parental engagement is a challenge. As a former juvenile probation officer myself, I know that that was certainly one of my challenge points at times in my career. Objective 2 is about ensuring equitable treatment for all youth by adhering to eligibility criteria. The juvenile drug treatment courts, this was a pretty bold step. We had never really known what is the best age group to be targeting, but the eligibility criteria now for juvenile drug treatment courts are very clear, that they need to be youth that are 14 years of age or older, that are youth that have a substance use disorder, and that is not further defined. So for those of you on the line that are our treatment providers, that could be mild, moderate, severe. But what's important here, it's not only the age and the substance use disorder, but that they have been assessed with a standardized and validated risk assessment, and that they are moderate or high risk for reoffending. So this is really not, when you're offering this level of intervention and support, you want to be targeting your resources at that moderate to high risk. Although I know that at times it can seem the population has, complex needs and can present some challenges, but we get the biggest return on the investment by targeting in on that moderate to high risk age bracket. So, but the key is using that validated risk assessment tool. And if you're participating in this call and you're from visions. Okay. Objective 3 is providing a juvenile drug treatment court process that engages the team fully and follows procedures fairly. And this guideline also really highlights work with parents, about working collaboratively with those parents and guardians and engaging it with active participation. So parents are active in the court itself, active in supervision and discipline in their home of their children, and in treatment programs. And this guideline talks, these guidelines under this objective talk quite a bit about judges interacting with participants in that non-judgmental and procedurally fair manner. There's a lot of discussion in this section about procedural justice and procedural fairness, where the youth has voice in the process, where they believe that staff is helpful and have their best interest at heart, and have a basic understanding of what is happening with them. And then it's not happening to them, it's happening with them. And that's the notion of procedural justice. And there's a great emerging literature also about procedural justice, not just in the court field, but of course in law enforcement interactions, in corrections as well. And we know you get better outcomes when individuals are treated with respect. They believe that the staff is helpful and have their best interest in heart, and they feel that they're being treated fairly. These next few objectives I'll keep moving through pretty quickly, but conducting comprehensive needs assessments that inform individualized case management. This is something that many juvenile courts, especially in Washington State, have done a really exceptional job with, which is utilizing a risk needs responsivity tool and then matching youth to interventions. This is something that's now being called out in the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court guidelines and required or being requested to kind of take this to a nationwide approach. But by doing these comprehensive assessments, you're not only screening participants for alcohol or other drugs, but their criminogenic need areas, their mental health needs. You're assessing for the traumatic trauma experiences and abuse and being able to address those as well. And then, of course, building on their needs and their strengths. Objective 5 is regarding implementation of contingency management, which in the juvenile drug treatment court world or the problem-solving court world is also called incentives and sanctions. Contingency management is borrowed heavily from the substance abuse field, of course, which is the rewards and punishers idea. And this objective does talk or cover about, again, fairness, consistency, receiving similar incentives and reinforcers as others do in the court, but still individualizing, because what is valuable And motivating to one youth may not be valuable and or motivating to another youth. So youth tell us continually in focus groups that it is that individualization becomes a greater motivator for them, especially when it comes to the rewards, and they can set out those goals, those SMART goals for themselves, small, measurable, obtainable, realistic, and time-bound. Short-term goals that they can work towards and start to feel some success. And again, you can, whether you're operating a drug treatment court or not, you can utilize that contingency management notion in your case planning. And so the guidelines do a really good job of a thorough covering of the importance of contingency management and community supervision. Objective 6, the nice thing in the guidelines is that the guidelines call out a whole list of various evidence-based substance use treatment programs that youth should be connected with or can be connected with. And in addition, this guideline, this objective in the following guidelines talks about the importance of prosocial connections. So we tend to do an incredible amount of work and great work with youth when they're involved in the juvenile justice system, but we don't do anything really about connecting them to prosocial anchors really in the community for their their life post juvenile court involvement or drug treatment court involvement. So it's important that that youth, whether they're in the juvenile justice system or in the JDTCs, receive help in practicing prosocial skills, but also, helping youth make those prosocial connections and anchors in the community. And then finally, one of my favorite objectives, and any of you are on the phone that know me, you know that I enjoy data and think that data should really drive program and practice. And that's what this objective is about, is monitoring and tracking all sorts of information about your program so that you can continue to make improvements in the program. But also you can monitor for completions or terminations, educational enrollment and attainment, and learn how to use data to drive changes to practice. And what we know is when we have juvenile drug treatment courts that are able to apply many of these factors that I've just breezed very quickly through, we do get good outcomes. We get significant reductions in recidivism, and more importantly, we have youth that are healthy and that move on to successful adulthood. And so there's a lot of information available here in these guidelines, and I would encourage you, even if you're not operating a juvenile drug treatment court, to take a look at them because of the amount of research and materials that are available and that you can utilize for your own court. And now I'm going to turn it back to my co-presenter, Josh, so he can give you some really specific ideas about dealing with adolescents with substance abuse issues. And I'll go ahead and skip these slides because I'm running out of time.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jacqueline, and I appreciate your presentation. I want to start off by just stating that there are lots of different ways to treat substance use in adolescents, and this is going to highlight one modality. All right. The goal of this presentation is to show that adolescent substance use is too complicated to be easily explained or solved by any quick fixes or silver bullets. But what we're going to try and do, hopefully, is show you how we can approach substance use from a very different perspective than traditional treatment as usual. What we know is traditional substance use treatments for adolescents tend to be based on adult models. There tends to be more of a focus on a group setting, which places substance using adolescents with other substance using adolescents. It tends not to be tailored to meet individual needs, but more focused on the needs of the group as a whole. And oftentimes, the emphasis is solely on the substance use and not taking in consideration some of the contextual factors which may increase the reasons why adolescents may use substances overall. Some of the ways that adolescents are treated tend to remove them from their homes and place them in settings which are artificial and very costly. So why do we say that this shouldn't be the direction to go in? Well, the best way to demonstrate this is my friend Calvin. Calvin, how did you break this dish? I was carrying too much and it dropped. Your problem is you have no common sense. I've got plenty of common sense. I just choose to ignore it. So what Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes does is really demonstrate really adolescent brain development, putting all of our time and effort into an adolescent where they're not in a place developmentally to really make good choices long term. Most adolescents in treatment, you don't say, you shouldn't use drugs. And they say, thank you. I didn't know that before. And now I know to do something different. The reality is we need to do something different in order to address this problem. The research shows that substance use is drawn from risk factors from the family, the peer group, the school, the community, as well as the youth. And this social ecological model presented by Bachman Brenner really says that the idea to address that child, that youth in the center, we can address it by focusing on that youth because that youth has impact on all the other settings around them, on the family, on the peers, on the neighborhood. Conversely, we can also put our energy and effort into addressing those other ecologies surrounding the youth. And if we change the way that the youth operates within those systems, we end up changing the way that youth must behave long term. This causal model of substance use really predicts that the highest reason or the best predictor for adolescent substance use is their prior substance use. Unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to go back in time and change anything. The next best predictor is their association with substance-using peers. Addressing youth and their peers can be very challenging. So if we go back a little bit further, the research shows that there are two factors that drive kids going to be around their negative peers. One is from the family, and another one is from the school. So research says that in families where there tends to be a low level of monitoring, no one knows where you are, low affection or low warmth, no one's really saying, I care about you, I love you, I need you here. And in families where there tends to be a lot of conflict, lots of fighting going on, these are the sorts of family dynamics that lead kids to not want to be in the house. I wouldn't want to be there. They don't want to be there either. And from a school perspective, if they're coming from a school where there's low school involvement, they're not involved in activities, whether it be sports, whether it be band, drama, etc. They don't really know the teachers really don't know them, and they're also having poor school performance. What happens? They end up dropping out, they skip school, they skip too much, they get suspended, and what do? They go hang out with all their other friends, and as the kids say, they weren't looking for trouble, trouble found them. So they end up being with other kids, end up using substances, leading to their own substance use long term. This next slide, I want you to take a minute to think about what are some of the reasons why adolescents may use substances. All right, given what you know, what are some of the reasons? Think about from the individual, some of the families you may have worked with, some of the communities that these kids are coming from. So I just want to give you about 10, 20, 30 seconds, because time is limited, to jot down a couple reasons why. All right. And now I'd like you to write down a couple ideas about what do you think it takes in order to stay clean. So let's imagine that this kid comes through and is now not using substances. What needs to be different in their world, in their environment, in order to keep them from staying clean? All right. So this is a very brief summary of some of the reasons why adolescents may use substances. Low monitoring, lack of consequences, their association with negative peers, it's kind of fun to use, they're not doing well at school, boredom, lack of positive activities, and easy access to substances. Some of the reasons why kids end up staying clean is they have good refusal skills, they may have very structured times, there's effective consequences and clear expectations at the household, they're not around peers who use, there's motivations or incentives to not use overall. They're also aware of what triggers they have themselves and are willing to change their ecology overall. So we know that the drivers for relapse, so if a young person is able to get clean, the reasons for relapse are fairly identical for the reasons for use. So keeping them in their natural environment initially makes more sense than trying to remove them from an environment, try and do something to them and put them back in that same environment. The more that we can work with young people in the world that they live in, that for some of these kids, it's as easy as going out the door and getting alcohol, getting substances. We need to make sure that we're working in ways that are aware of their own world, their own ecology, in order to make sustainable changes. So additional reasons why kids may use, I'll just put this slide up for a second. We know that being around their peers, where they're not doing well in school, neighborhoods where there's high crime, easy availability of drugs, etc., makes it easier and easier for kids to use. So if we want to address or change this, one of the ways we need to go about this is really do more of looking at the functionality of its use. We want to learn where and when and with whom the youth usually uses. We want to obtain detailed sequences regarding when they use. We want to go about and understand what they've done in the past in order to try and stop using, understand the reasons why they end up using medication using substances overall. And we want to understand what's different when the young person doesn't use substances as much as possible. Once we have an understanding around that pattern of substance use, we can go about with a variety of interventions. And I'm going to go through these interventions very quickly due to time. Many of these, we could spend entire sessions on going through any one of these overall. But the overall ideas are really we need to engage the caregivers. We need to make sure that it's not just the youth that we're trying to look at and treat. We need to try and treat that youth in that context, working with mom and dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, working with the neighbors, the friends, people in the school. We really want to engage with as many people in the ecology as much as possible. We want to make sure that we can identify signs of use, reduce access to substances, as much as possible, alter those peers and community ecologies, help the parents develop better ways of disciplining, improve the home-school link so that we know school can be an incredibly protective factor for adolescents in general. We need to make sure that they're going to school and are thriving in school as much as possible, helping the schools develop ways to work with kids overall. We want to make sure that the caregivers are involved in any of the interventions that we end up doing individually. We need to make sure that the caregivers are involved because they're the ones that are there long term. Treatment providers are there in kids' lives for very short periods of time. So if we want long-term changes to occur in households, we need to make sure that what we're doing is involving the parents, the caregivers, as a part of that treatment overall. So one of the ways that we would go about helping a caregiver would be helping that parent learn how to increase supervision, to reduce the opportunities to access drugs and alcohol. We want to remove or secure substances in all the settings as much as possible, helping parents learn how to search for drugs overall. Also looking at what are some of those drivers or triggers for use. Could be, money in the pocket, so that kid may have money from a job or may get $20 from grandma for his or her birthday. We need to know if they get that money, what they're going to do with it so they don't go right out and use that money to buy substances if that's one of the issues overall. We want to make sure that we're addressing the youth's peers as much as possible, making sure the parents are aware of, first of all, who is your son or daughter hanging out with and what do you know about them? Are they good or bad? Imagine putting kids on a scale, green, yellow, red. Green, no problem. Yellow, maybe, maybe not. Red, we're going to do everything possible to try and keep you away from them as much as possible. One of the ways we want to do that is make sure parents know how to assess the peers. We want to make sure that we have opportunities to get kids involved in prosocial activities. As Jacqueline mentioned previously, we want to try and do as much as we can to decrease their association with negative peers overall, and engage stakeholders, many of you on this call, in putting youth in settings with other youth who use. That may also include AA, and I'm aware that's can be a pretty trigger-happy subject to talk about, but kids that are not motivated, being placed, mandated in settings where they don't really want to change and being around other antisocial youth ends up leading to an iatrogenic effect where they may end up learning other ways to get substances, how to avoid drug tests, etc. So it's not really a great opportunity. We're a lot better off trying to improve the prosocial activities and work on some of the other things individually and with their family than trying to put them in a group setting overall. We want to help parents with discipline factors as much as possible, learning how to have clear behavior plans, deliver effective consequences. As Jacqueline mentioned, contingency management is a great opportunity, and I'm giving you a citation for a wonderful workbook that is well worth your time and effort to review. It gives wonderful scripts and illustrations on how to provide contingency management overall. We want to make sure that we're involving the family in self-management, so helping the family to understand some of the ecological reasons for use, those triggers of the situations that put the kids at high risk. At times, working on ways to rearrange the ecology, so having their son or daughter take a different route to school rather than going down the street where the drug dealer is. We're going to go a different route in order to make sure they're not going to be around that ecology, and helping them develop new plans. What are they going to be doing different? If they're not using substances, what are they doing instead of? You can't just say, don't do this unless you give them opportunities to do this instead. Because if you create a vacuum, it's really hard to maintain that. You need to put something else in that space in order for new behaviors to occur. So my very brief case example, imagine you have James, a 16-year-old white male living at home with his mother and younger sisters, has been skipping school over half the possible days, non-compliant at home, theft charges, as well as using marijuana at home in the community, using about $20 to $80 worth of marijuana a week overall. Efforts to get James to attend outpatient was ineffective. He just refused to attend as much as possible. Eventually, he was referred to a home-based therapy model, models such as multisystemic therapy, where they looked at the function of his substance use and identified a couple key reasons. These lacks of clear expectations at home, low monitoring or supervision, ineffective incentives or consequences for use, as well as ineffective coping skills for James himself. So the clinician spent time understanding the function of the substance use, getting information from mother. Mother was brought through a process to increase her social supports in order to increase not only her ability to monitor, but also to hold her son accountable. So maybe mom wasn't able to enforce a rule, but she was able to pull in one of her older brothers to come in. So James's uncle was now available to help support. We developed a safety plan to help reduce the risk of escalations at home, because we know for James to get these rules and consequences, he's not going to be very happy about it. There tends to be something called an extinction burst, where the behaviors that that young person displays will get worse before they get better in order to try and get the parent to back down and give up. So it's really important that we're doing pre-planning to prepare for this, making sure there's clear safety plans as much as possible. Mother, with the assistance of her supports, identified several prosocial activities and set clear expectations for his behavior, as well as linking consequences and incentives. The clinician and mom work with James to assist him in developing alternative coping skills and ways to manage his urges, as well as developing refusal skills. How will he manage to say no and not be around his friends when they call and say, hey, let's go hang out? How is he going to manage to do that and save face? So learning refusal skills to manage in those situations is vital. As I mentioned, none of this happens quickly. The process took 5 to 6 months of intensive therapy, 2 to 3 appointments a week, 24/7 coverage and support available to the parents. James pushed limits several times. Mom was able to engage and work with James's probation counselor for additional support, as well as accountability. And at the time of closure, James's overall behavior had improved, although there was a slip approximately 3 weeks prior to ending where James admitted to smoking. However, what we know is Mom was able to enforce a consequence for his behavior and address it. So we moved from substance being this super behavior or this crisis to the sort of problem that family is able to manage effectively. Not that it's going to be easy, not that there won't be problems or slips or lapses along the way, but ultimately it's trying to ensure that the caregivers, the family, have the skills necessary in order to manage those problems as they come up, rather than turning towards the police, towards probation, towards a judge to solve the problem. So that's a very quick way of working through one way of addressing substance use, and I'm just trying to finish in time to make sure we have time for questions. So I apologize for rushing through some of this.
Okay, thanks so much, Josh, and of course, Dr. Van Warmer for the previous talk. So we are going to go to the questions now, but before, let's go a little bit about to let you know. Hold on. Okay, here we go. So before going to the questions, you're gonna get a short survey, a link to a short survey that are very important to us to have answers to. It helps us a lot in our programming and in our ability to report to our agencies. So we are gonna send the short survey right now, and then in a month as a follow-up. We appreciate you answering this to us. Something that is I see here in the list of questions and always come up, but it was said right on the beginning, the presentation slides and the whole webinar will be available in our website. So no worries on that. And before I start again with the questions, I just wanted to remind everybody that every month we have our webinars, and our next webinar is going to be in a month and is about PrEP for HIV prevention of people that use substances. So I hope you can join us. That being said, let's do the questions then. So I'm gonna try to select, condense, and do my best here. A lot of the questions and notes were attempt of the public to participate in the whole process of the questions that Josh was making. So we'll go from, I'm going to skip those and get some questions. Most of the questions here are for Josh. I've been talking on the side with Dr. Van Warmer, and she's comfortable that we focus on the questions that are for Josh. So our first question is, do you have suggestions of instead using the term staying clean of another term that will be less stigmatizing?
Boy, that's a great question. And I wish I had a great answer for that. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but I'd love to hear if within this collective group there are some ideas about ways to describe this that would come across as less stigmatizing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing here staying abstinent or staying sober or abstinent could be some options to consider. Okay.
This is Jackie. Can I jump in here?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a great question, and I have seen that so I'm reading some of this feedback. It is great because I've noticed that in my work with juvenile drug treatment courts, many teams have shifted their language away from that idea of staying clean and counting clean days. Again, because we are dealing with adolescents in their states of adolescent development, and many courts now consider more of a harm reduction model rather than the complete abstinence model. But I know that that, of course, is for another conversation as well. But kind of expanding just around staying healthy is something that I've certainly heard quite a few courts using, or meeting goals. And that's kind of ties back to what I was talking about, where you're working with the youth through a comprehensive case management plan to set those small, those SMART goals, and then of course to be able to work towards some larger goals.
Thanks, Jackie. So yeah, and there are, right after we started, there are several options here to consider on using different wording. There's another question that I thought was interesting. Again, I have the executive decision here, picking on some that I think it makes a lot of sense for us to discuss in this group. We usually do a follow-up of questions later on as well, the ones that could not be addressed. So there is something about the goal of decreased contact with youth that have used substance as well as something desirable. So the question is, what is the data for kids involved with peer recovery coaches who may eventually also relapse? So any comment on that?
Boy, unfortunately, I'm not aware personally of the research around that modality around peer recovery. So I apologize. I can't respond to that.
Mm-hmm. Any comment, Jackie?
No, I just have a very light understanding of the peer recovery literature as well. So I apologize to Meg and others.
Okay. Okay. So so here I'm looking. You guys also have access to the questions. I see there is some discussion around the brain injury and TBI. I have to confess I'm not being able to understand the connection here. If you guys can read or I can read and want to comment on it, I'll be happy if you do. I'm not quite sure what the connection is.
Well, I think it's a valid point. I believe this was Carla Joe that wrote this. Mm-hmm. The TBI, and certainly there is quite a bit of emerging information about TBI, and I certainly agree. It often goes undiagnosed or even or not even considered, and can have these long-term negative consequences, like Carla Joe says here, because of the misunderstanding, and then it manifests in what is believed to be in other ways, and people get pulled into the juvenile justice system, for example, when in fact they should be treated within the public health system. So again, I think we're just in the process of learning quite a bit about that.
Okay. Should treatment providers put more emphasis on parents' report on youth substance use history and current patterns of use report, or use report? So basically put more emphasis in parents or on youth report.
My perspective would be, I think, utilizing the parents' report, providing that the caregivers are wanting to support and not just cover. Again, we need to make sure that parents are feeling free and open to share what's actually happening at home, not just trying to say what the right thing that providers or the courts want to hear. Many of the parents may come across initially as being very protective, and of course, most parents are very protective of their own kids. So we need to make sure that we're all aligned on the same goals long term in order for that to be effective. So I want to make sure that we can look at ensuring that parents are really aligned with the goals that we have and not being taken necessarily at face value. We want the parents' perspective, but we also want multiple perspectives too, to ensure that we're getting as much validity as possible.
Okay, thanks. So since we are on the parent and youth here, so do you know of any best practice curriculum to use with adolescents and their families?
Well, I mentioned multisystemic therapy is one modality to work with young people and families. Functional family therapy, FFT, is another great model that can be effective overall. And I know there are others. I'm sure that in Jackie's slides, it will lead to some other treatments that are effective working in the home and the community.
Yeah, if you spend a little bit of time out on the OJJDP website, hovering over those different radial dials, you'll find a whole list of different modalities. But Josh, you mentioned here the Contingency Management for Adolescent Substance Abuse, the Practitioner's Guide. I highly recommend that. That work by Scott, and like you said, it has even like script. And there is, while it's not a curriculum, it's a lot of ideas for practitioners, but not only how to engage with the youth, but with parents or caregivers as well. There's some of that in there as well. So it's a great resource.
Would you mind reading the name of the book? Because I cannot possibly pronounce the last name of the author. It's here, but I'm not sure everybody is looking at this.
Okay. So the name of the book is Contingency Management for Adolescent Substance Abuse, a Practitioner's Guide, and it's written by Scott Henglinger, Philippe Cunningham, Lisa Rowland, Sonia Schoenwald, and Associates. And it was published in 2012.
And is mentioned here in the chat box for you guys that may want to see it. Yeah, so another question that I think that could be more for Dr. Van Walmer. What reach do the courts have in having parents attend parenting classes?
Well, I'm going to give my lawyerly response, which is it depends. So in Washington State, if the parent is involved in the family dependency court process, the court has much greater reign and involvement. But if the youth is involved in the criminal court or delinquency court, then the court is more limited, and it's often a voluntary process. If the youth is involved in a juvenile drug treatment court, although the program is, of course, very focused on the adolescent, depending on how the agreement is written for participation, parents may be required or agree to participate in parenting classes. But the level and requirement of parental involvement, whether they're a mandatory party to the delinquency or criminal proceeding, varies by state.
Good. Thank you. I'm gonna mention again, because we got these questions. So all the copy of the presentation slides and also the entire presentation is going to be available as soon as we finish this in our website. So that is Northwest ATTC website, of course. Somebody here saying that they could not write the title of the book fast enough. I will answer in the chat box here for you, Karen. Just hold a second, because I'm doing too many things at once.
It's also in the slides.
It is also in the slides. Okay, that is going to be available right after that. Okay. So there is another question here. How do you manage drug court kids with opioid use disorders to get them in buprenorphine? Don't they have to go to a substance use disorder licensed facility, most of which don't prescribe? Anything that you would like to say?
Yeah, Meg, that is an hour-long conversation we could probably have regarding the opioid use disorder and getting them MAT, medication-assisted treatment. Again, it does depend on the community. It does have to be a licensed facility. if you're interested, the National Association of Drug Court Professionals has if you go out to their website, they have quite a bit of information about MAT. There's just not as much information available for adolescents as there is for adults. But again, it does depend on the community.
Thanks. There is one question from Brittany. Do you have any knowledge of works to destigmatize substance use disorders addicts? I would strongly recommend our previous webinar. So it's recorded and available in our website. That is exactly about this topic about stigmatization, and a lot of suggestions on research on it and how destigmatize using different language. Also, Karen, I just got to you the copy, the reference of the book again. Please let me know. It's the last one in the stream of questions here. Okay, we have a few minutes to go. I'm looking here, and so I see, again, some questions from Meg about prescription monitoring program. I think that was covered. Annie, I would like to say, for me, I would like, what would be example, Josh, of a home-based treatment that you would recommend for adolescent substance use?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think multisystemic therapy is one of the models that's available in some of the counties in Washington State, as well as throughout the U.S. and internationally also, that has a strong track record in addressing not only antisocial behavior, but substance use. So that would be the first one that I would recommend, that tends to be the most holistic and works with really the whole ecology, not just the family, but working with all the different systems, works with the school, works with the peer group, works with the community at large. So for those young people that are coming in with more complicated and challenging behaviors, which unfortunately we're seeing more and more of, for those that that come to juvenile justice attention, you tend to need something that's going to be more comprehensive and effective.
And what about if the adolescent does not want to participate in treatment? What would you recommend?
I'm sorry, if what?
If the adolescent does not want to participate in treatment.
Well, I think that's one of the great advantages of having an ecological approach to working with substance, is that, again, most kids that come to the court's attention aren't saying, I want to stop using, right? They're saying, I want to continue doing and living the life that I'm having fun with. They're not motivated to change. So rather than trying to put all our energy and trying to engage this adolescent in changing their behavior, which from their perspective is functional for them, trying to engage the parents and all those other systems seems to make more sense, and it's easier to address. So you don't need to get that adolescent's buy-in in order to change their behavior, right? By changing the ecology around them, their behavior has to shift. They're not getting the same ability to use as before. They're not having the same reinforcers. They're finding that the consequences are getting worse and worse. So for example, for a clinician to tell me, the kid answered the door and said, you're ruining my family, to me, that means we're making great progress in that adolescent's home, because what they're doing is no longer reinforced. They're not getting away with what they were using before. So therapy does not necessarily mean all the time that the adolescent's going to be happy with the change, but we're focused on what's going to be helpful for that adolescent long-term, not just today and tomorrow.
Okay, at that, we are gonna finish our webinar today. I wanna thank so much the two speakers that made this possible, and for you attendees that honor us with your presence. Have a good afternoon, and thank you very much, and come on to our next webinar.